Daniel Cooper sat alone in his small apartment on the mining colony of Kepler 442b and stared at the photograph on his desk, showing a smiling woman with dark hair and warm brown eyes that seemed to look right through the camera and into his soul. 3 years had passed since the illness took her away, and every day felt longer than the one before it, because the silence in his home was the kind that pressed against his chest and made breathing feel like work. The colony had 247 people living in it, and somehow Daniel felt more alone here than he ever had on Earth, because everyone else seemed to have someone to share their meals with or laugh with, or just sit quietly beside while watching the twin moons rise over the red mountains. He had his work checking sensors and maintaining the perimeter systems, and he had his routine of waking up and going to the cafeteria and nodding at familiar faces and then going back to his apartment when the day ended. His friends had tried to help at first with invitations to dinners and game nights and community gatherings, but after a while they stopped asking, because Daniel always found a reason to say no, and eventually people just let him be alone with his grief. He knew they meant well, but he could not shake the feeling that moving forward would somehow be betraying the memory of the woman he had loved since he was 23 years old. The morning everything changed started like any other morning with Daniel pulling on his work suit and grabbing his scanner, and heading out to check the eastern perimeter sensors that had been acting strangely for the past few days. The colony director thought it might be interference from the mineral deposits in the nearby mountains, but Daniel suspected it was something else, because the readings did not match any known geological patterns. He was halfway to the sensor array when the sky suddenly grew dark and he looked up thinking a storm was rolling in from the mountains. But what he saw made him freeze in his tracks with his mouth hanging open. 2 enormous creatures were circling overhead with wingspans that had to be at least 60 feet across and scales that caught the morning light and threw it back in shades of silver and gold that hurt to look at directly. Dragons. They were actual dragons, like something out of ancient Earth legends or children's stories, and they were real and flying above his tiny mining colony on a planet that was supposed to have nothing more dangerous than rock lizards and tunnel rats. Daniel's hand started shaking as he raised his scanner and tried to get a reading, but the device just beeped uselessly because it had no reference data for whatever these creatures were made of. The dragons began descending in wide spirals, and Daniel realized with growing alarm that they were going to land right near the colony perimeter where he was standing. His training said he should run back and sound the alarm and get everyone to the shelters, but his feet would not move because he was transfixed by the impossible beauty of these creatures as they came closer and closer. They landed with surprising grace about 50 yards away from him, and the ground shook slightly under their weight, and Daniel could feel the heat radiating from their bodies like standing near a furnace. The silver dragon was slightly larger, with scales that seemed to shimmer like water, and eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was definitely not animal. The gold dragon was sleeker and more agile-looking, with horns that curved back from its head like a crown. But what really made Daniel's heart stop was the figure sitting between the 2 dragons on some kind of saddle or platform. It was a woman, but not like any woman Daniel had ever seen, because she had pointed ears that swept back from her head, and silver hair that fell past her shoulders in waves that seemed to move on their own. Her skin had a faint glow to it like she was lit from within, and her eyes were the color of starlight. She was wearing armor that looked like it was made from dragon scales, but in shades of blue and green that shifted as she moved, and she carried no visible weapons, but something about the way she held herself made it clear she did not need any. She looked at Daniel with those strange glowing eyes, and for the first time in 3 years he felt something other than the dull ache of loss. The woman slid down from the golden dragon's back with fluid grace and walked toward Daniel with her hands held out to show she meant no harm. He should have been terrified, or at least cautious, but instead, he found himself walking toward her like he was in a dream and could not control his own legs. When she was about 10 feet away, she stopped and spoke in a voice that sounded like music and made Daniel think of wind chimes and flowing water. The strange part was that even though the words sounded foreign, he somehow understood them perfectly, as if they were being translated directly into his mind. She said her name was Lyra, and she was an elf from a world called Silverwood that existed in a different part of the galaxy, and she had been traveling through space for 6 months, searching for a rare mineral that her people needed for their healing temples. The 2 dragons were named Storm and Ember, and they had been her companions for over 300 years. And they were just as intelligent as any person, even though they could not speak in words. Daniel realized his mouth was still hanging open, and he snapped it shut and tried to find his voice, which had apparently decided to take a vacation. He managed to croak out his name and his job title and something about the colony being peaceful, and then he felt like an idiot, because what else would you say to an elf riding dragons who just landed in your backyard? Lyra smiled and it transformed, her face from beautiful to absolutely radiant, and Daniel felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 3 years start to crack. She explained that the mineral she was looking for was called star crystal, and it grew deep underground in cave systems on planets with specific geological conditions, and her instruments indicated that Kepler 442b might have deposits of it. She asked if Daniel could help her locate possible cave systems, and in return she would share knowledge from her world, and maybe some of the healing magic that her people possessed. The way she said it was not demanding or entitled, but genuinely hopeful, like she was used to being turned away and would understand if he said no. Daniel looked at this impossible woman with her impossible dragons, and thought about his empty apartment and his endless routine, and the photograph on his desk of someone who would never want him to stop living. He thought about how the most interesting thing that had happened to him in 3 years was a malfunctioning sensor array. He said yes. He would help her find her star crystals and show her the geological surveys and take her to the places where caves might exist. Lyra's smile grew even brighter, and behind her, the 2 dragons made sounds that were somehow clearly pleased, and Daniel Cooper made a decision that would change the entire course of his life, even though he did not know it yet. Storm the silver dragon lowered his massive head and looked at Daniel with eyes that seemed ancient and knowing, and Daniel reached out without thinking and touched the smooth scales on the dragon's nose. They were warm and harder than steel, but also somehow gentle, and Storm made a rumbling sound deep in his chest that Daniel felt in his bones. The colony director was a stern woman named Patricia Green, who had run mining operations on 4 different planets and claimed nothing could surprise her anymore. But when Daniel brought Lyra and her dragons to the main administration building, Patricia's face went through several interesting color changes. She stared at the elf woman for a full minute without speaking, and then looked at the 2 dragons who had settled themselves outside the building, like patient guard dogs, and then looked back at Daniel with an expression that clearly said he had lost his mind. Lyra handled the situation with remarkable patience and explained again about the star crystals and how they were essential for healing temples on her world, and how she had been traveling from planet to planet for months searching for them. She offered to share medical knowledge in exchange for permission to search the cave systems, and she promised that Storm and Ember would not eat any livestock or damage any equipment. Patricia asked if the dragons actually ate livestock, and Lyra laughed and said no. They preferred fish and were perfectly capable of catching their own meals from the large lake 10 miles north of the colony. She also mentioned that elves had been traveling through space for thousands of years and had encountered humans before, though not often, and she found them fascinating because they adapted to impossible situations with remarkable creativity. The director finally agreed, but only if Daniel accompanied Lyra at all times and filed regular reports and made sure the dragons stayed away from the main power generators. Daniel agreed immediately, even though it meant he would be spending every day with this strange, beautiful woman who made his heart beat faster and his frozen grief feel less heavy. Over the next week, Daniel showed Lyra the geological survey maps, and together they identified 3 cave systems that might contain the star crystals she needed. The first 2 were relatively shallow and easy to access, but turned out to be empty of anything except regular quartz formations and some interesting fungi that Lyra collected in small containers for study. During these expeditions, Daniel learned more about Lyra and her world than he thought possible. She told him that elves lived for thousands of years and that she was currently 843 years old, which made Daniel feel very young and very mortal. She explained that Silverwood was a planet covered mostly in forests with trees that grew miles high and cities built in the branches, and that most elves never left their world because they feared the loneliness of space. Dragons were rare on Silverwood, and most elves considered them too dangerous and unpredictable to bond with. But Lyra had found Storm and Ember as hatchlings in a mountain cave and raised them herself. The other elves had called her foolish and reckless, but the bonds she formed with her dragons were stronger than any bond she had with her own people. so she left Silverwood and became a wanderer. Daniel found himself sharing his own story in return, and told Lyra about Earth and about meeting his wife in college, and about the 15 years they had together before the illness came. He told her about the grief that felt like drowning and the loneliness that followed, and how he had volunteered for the colony assignment because he wanted to be as far from his old life as possible. Lyra listened with tears shining in her ancient eyes, and when Daniel finished talking, she reached out and took his hand. Her skin was warm and smooth, and the touch sent electricity up his arm. She told him that loneliness was the same whether you lived for 50 years or 5,000 years, and that she understood the weight of loss because she had watched many friends grow old and die while she remained unchanged. They sat together in comfortable silence while Storm and Ember dozed nearby, and Daniel realized that for the first time since his wife died, he did not feel completely alone. There was something about Lyra that made him want to keep living and keep moving forward instead of just existing in his routine of grief. The third cave system was much deeper and more dangerous than the first two, and the colony had marked it as restricted because of unstable rock formations and toxic gas pockets. Daniel suggested they skip it and look for other locations, but Lyra's instruments were showing strong readings of star crystal, and she insisted they at least investigate the entrance. Storm and Ember could not fit into the cave opening, so they stayed outside, and both dragons seemed unhappy about letting Lyra go underground without them. Storm made worried rumbling sounds and kept nudging Lyra with his massive head, while Ember paced back and forth like an anxious cat. Lyra spoke to them in a language that sounded like wind and water, and eventually the dragons settled down, though they still watched the cave entrance with focused intensity. Daniel checked his oxygen supply and his safety gear and then followed Lyra into the darkness with his heart pounding because he had been on many cave expeditions, but never with someone he was starting to care about. The cave was beautiful in a terrifying way, with formations that looked like frozen waterfalls and passages that twisted in impossible directions. Lyra's hands began to glow with a soft white light that she said was a type of magic that all elves possessed, and the light was enough for them to see by without using their electric torches. They went deeper and deeper following Lyra's instruments, and Daniel found himself watching her more than watching where he was going. The way she moved was like dancing, and her silver hair seemed to float around her shoulders, and every so often, she would stop and touch a rock formation and smile like she was greeting an old friend. After 2 hours of careful climbing, they entered a chamber that took Daniel's breath away. The walls were covered in crystals that glowed with a soft blue light like bottled starlight, and the air hummed with energy that made his skin tingle. Lyra gasped, and her face lit up with pure joy as she moved toward the crystals with her hands outstretched. She explained in an excited voice that these were definitely star crystals, and they were some of the purest specimens she had ever seen, and that there was enough here to power her people's healing temples for years. She began carefully harvesting the crystals using tools from her pack and placing them in padded containers, while talking about how these crystals could heal injuries that would otherwise be fatal and cure diseases that had no other treatment. Daniel helped her work and listened to her talk and felt something he had not felt in 3 years, which was happiness. Not the fake smile happiness he showed to his co-workers, but real genuine joy at being alive and being in this moment with this person. He realized he was falling for Lyra, and the thought both terrified and excited him. They worked for another hour collecting crystals until Lyra's containers were full, and she declared they had enough. They began the long climb back to the surface, and Daniel was thinking about what he would say to her when they got outside, and whether she felt the same connection he did. That was when the cave started shaking. At first it was just a small tremor, but it quickly grew stronger and rocks began falling from the ceiling. Daniel grabbed Lyra and pulled her against the wall and covered her body with his as debris rained down around them. The shaking lasted for maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like forever. When the dust settled, they realized with growing horror that the passage behind them had collapsed completely, and they were trapped deep underground with limited oxygen and no way to call for help because the rock was blocking their radio signals. Daniel's hands were shaking as he checked his oxygen gauge and saw that he had maybe 4 hours of air left at normal breathing rates, and maybe 6 if he stayed calm and controlled his panic. Lyra did not need oxygen equipment because elves could breathe in conditions that would kill humans, but she looked worried as she examined the collapsed passage and ran her glowing hands over the rocks. The rockfall had completely blocked the way they came in, and Daniel could see from the way the stones were wedged together that it would take days to dig through manually, even if they had the right equipment. His mind started racing through options, and every scenario ended badly because nobody knew exactly where they were in the cave. System and Storm and Ember could not dig through solid rock to reach them. Lyra turned to face him, and her eyes were glowing brighter than before, and she told him not to panic, because elves had magic that could help in situations like this. She explained that her people had an ancient ability to communicate with stone and earth, and convince it to move in ways that defied normal physics, but it required intense concentration and a lot of energy. Daniel wanted to believe her, but his rational mind that had been trained in engineering and geology was having trouble accepting that someone could just ask rocks to move. Still, he had already accepted that elves and dragons existed, so maybe magic was not such a stretch. He told Lyra he trusted her and asked what he could do to help. She smiled at him, and that smile made his chest feel warm despite their dangerous situation. She instructed him to sit against the wall and keep his breathing steady and stay calm, because his fear would make her work harder. Then she approached the rockfall and placed both hands against the largest boulder and closed her eyes. At first, nothing happened, and Daniel started to worry that maybe this magic thing would not work after all. But then Lyra began to glow with that same white light that came from her hands, except now it was coming from her entire body and spreading into the rocks she was touching. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, and Daniel could hear her speaking in that wind and water language. The rocks started to vibrate and then to shift, and Daniel watched in amazement as boulders that weighed several tons began moving aside like they were made of foam. Lyra's face showed intense concentration, and sweat was running down her forehead, but she kept working and kept speaking to the stone, and gradually a passage began to open. It took almost an hour, and by the end, Lyra was exhausted and pale and swaying on her feet, but there was a tunnel through the rockfall just wide enough for them to crawl through. Daniel caught her as she stumbled backward and held her steady while she caught her breath. She looked up at him with those starlight eyes and apologized for taking so long. Daniel almost laughed because she had just done something impossible and saved both their lives, and she was apologizing. He told her she was amazing, and before he could think about what he was doing, he kissed her forehead. Lyra's eyes went wide with surprise, but then she smiled and leaned against him for a moment before pulling back and saying they should keep moving because the cave might not be stable. They crawled through the passage Lyra had created and continued making their way toward the surface. The journey took another 2 hours because they had to move carefully and check every passage for stability. Daniel's oxygen was getting low, and he could feel himself getting lightheaded, but he focused on following Lyra's glowing form through the darkness. When they finally emerged from the cave entrance, Storm and Ember went absolutely crazy with relief. The two dragons had been clawing at the rocks, and both of them had bloodied talons from trying to dig their way in. They immediately surrounded Lyra and Daniel and made worried rumbling sounds while checking them over for injuries. Storm lowered his massive head and pressed it against Daniel's chest so gently it was like being hugged by a mountain. Ember did the same to Lyra, and the elf woman wrapped her arms around her dragon's nose and whispered soothing words. Daniel realized that the dragons had been just as worried about him as they were about Lyra, and something about that made his eyes sting with tears. They flew back to the colony on the dragons' backs, with Daniel riding behind Lyra on Storm and holding onto her waist, because there was no other safe way to stay on. The feeling of flying was incredible and terrifying, and Daniel found himself pressing closer to Lyra, not just for safety, but because being near her made him feel more alive than he had in years. Patricia was waiting for them at the landing area with a medical team and several security personnel who all stared at the dragons with mixed expressions of wonder and fear. The director demanded a full report and seemed both relieved that they were safe and annoyed that they had taken such a risk. She also noticed the way Daniel and Lyra stood close together and the way they looked at each other, and her stern expression softened slightly. That evening, after the debriefing and the medical checks, Daniel found Lyra sitting alone near the edge of the colony watching the twin moons rise. He sat down beside her, and for a while they just enjoyed the comfortable silence. Then Lyra spoke and told him that in all her 843 years she had never met anyone quite like him. She explained that humans had a quality that other species lacked, which was the ability to find hope, even in the darkest situations, and to form deep connections quickly and completely. Most elves took decades to become close friends, but Daniel had become important to her in just a few weeks, and she did not know what to do with these feelings. Daniel's heart was pounding as he told her that he felt the same way, and that being with her made him feel like he was waking up from a long sleep. He admitted that he had thought he would never care about anyone again after his wife died, but Lyra had somehow slipped past all his defenses and made him want to live again instead of just exist. Lyra turned to look at him, and her eyes were shining with tears, and she asked if he understood what it meant that she was 800 years old and would live for thousands more while he would age and die in what was for her just a blink of time. She said she could not bear the thought of watching another person she loved grow old and fade away. Daniel thought about it carefully because this was not a decision to make lightly. Then he asked if there was any way for a human to live longer, and Lyra went very still and quiet. After a long moment, she explained that elves could share their lifespan with someone they loved if both parties agreed, and if the bond was strong enough. It was rare and required a deep magical connection, but it was possible. She told him that if they went through with such a bonding, he would live for as long as she did, and would gain some of her magical abilities. But he would also be bound to her in ways that could never be undone. He would feel her emotions, and she would feel his, and they would be connected across any distance. It was not a decision to make quickly or lightly. Daniel did not need time to think about it. He had spent 3 years being alone and afraid to feel anything, and now he had a chance to spend centuries with someone who made him feel truly alive. He told Lyra he wanted the bond if she would have him, and she started crying and laughing at the same time and said yes. They sat together under the twin moons and held hands and talked about the future and about the adventures they would have together. Storm and Ember joined them eventually, and the two dragons curled around them protectively, and Daniel felt like he had found his family. The next 3 weeks were the happiest Daniel had experienced in years as he and Lyra spent every possible moment together, and he learned more about her world and her life and the incredible bond she shared with Storm and Ember. The dragons had accepted him completely, and often Storm would seek him out for attention and rumble contentedly when Daniel scratched the spot behind his horns that the dragon could not reach himself. Lyra taught Daniel some basic elf magic, starting with the glowing light that came from the hands, and Daniel was amazed when after days of practice his own palms began to emit a faint silvery glow. She explained that humans normally could not use magic, but because they were preparing for the lifespan bond, his body was already starting to change and adapt to accommodate her gifts. The colony residents had gotten used to seeing the dragons around, and children especially loved Storm and Ember and would bring them fish from the lake as treats. Patricia had been skeptical at first, but even she had to admit that having 2 dragons protecting the perimeter was better than any security system, and there had been 0 problems with the large predators that sometimes came down from the mountains. Daniel knew he needed to make a decision about his future with the colony, because if he bonded with Lyra, he would be leaving with her to travel the stars and search for more star crystals and help people on different worlds. The thought of leaving was both terrifying and exciting, because this colony had been his home for 3 years, and these people had supported him through his grief. He went to Patricia's office one morning and told her everything about the bonding and about his plans to leave with Lyra and about how guilty he felt for abandoning his duties. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she surprised him by smiling and telling him she had been waiting for him to come talk to her about this. She said she had watched him for 3 years, barely living and just going through the motions, and seeing him come alive again over the past weeks had been wonderful to witness. She told him that everyone in the colony wanted him to be happy and that they would miss him, but they understood. She also mentioned that having a friend who traveled the galaxy with an elf and 2 dragons would be excellent for the colony's reputation. Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders, and he thanked Patricia and promised to stay in touch and send messages whenever he could. She hugged him, which surprised them both because Patricia was not known for being affectionate, and she told him to take care of himself and to remember that he always had a home to return to if he needed one. Lyra had been preparing for the bonding ceremony by meditating and gathering her magical energy, and she explained to Daniel that the ritual itself was simple but intense. They would need to be in a place of natural power, and they would need Storm and Ember present to witness and strengthen the bond. The nearest place that met these requirements was the mountain lake where the dragons liked to fish. They flew to the lake on a clear morning when both moons were still visible in the sky, and the water reflected the mountains like a perfect mirror. Lyra had prepared a circle of stones on the shore and placed star crystals at specific points around the circle because their energy would help stabilize the magic during the bonding. Daniel stood in the center of the circle, feeling nervous and excited and trying not to think too hard about what he was about to do, because if he analyzed it too much, he might lose his courage. Lyra stood across from him wearing a simple white dress that seemed to glow in the morning light, and her silver hair was loose around her shoulders. Storm and Ember took positions on either side of the circle, and both dragons began humming in harmony, and the sound resonated in Daniel's chest and made his bones vibrate. Lyra began speaking in her wind and water language and raised her hands, and the star crystals started glowing brighter and brighter until the whole circle was filled with blue light. She switched to words Daniel could understand and told him to open his heart and his mind and accept the gift she was offering. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to relax, and suddenly he felt something flowing into him like warm water filling an empty vessel. It was Lyra's life force and her magic and her memories and her emotions all pouring into him at once. He saw flashes of her long life in the forests of Silverwood and the day she found Storm and Ember as tiny hatchlings in a cave. He felt her loneliness from centuries of wandering and her joy at meeting him and her hope for their future together. The rush of sensations was overwhelming, and he gasped and opened his eyes. Lyra was glowing so brightly she was hard to look at directly, and tears were streaming down her face, and Daniel realized he was crying too. He could feel her presence in his mind now, like she was standing right beside him, even though they were several feet apart. The connection was deeper and more intimate than anything he had ever experienced, and for a moment he panicked because it was too much. But then Lyra's voice was in his mind, soothing and gentle, telling him to breathe and relax and trust the process. Daniel focused on her mental presence, and gradually the panic faded and was replaced by a sense of rightness and completion, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. He reached out with his mind and touched her consciousness and felt her joy at being connected to him. The ceremony lasted another hour as the magic settled into his body and changed him on a fundamental level. When it finally ended and the glow faded, Daniel felt different in ways he could not quite explain. His senses were sharper and he could hear things he had never noticed before, like the individual heartbeats of the fish in the lake. His body felt stronger and more alive, and he knew without being told that he would no longer age the way humans normally did. Lyra collapsed, and Daniel caught her and held her while she recovered her strength. She looked up at him with exhausted happiness and told him it was done, and they were bonded for life, and he would live for thousands of years with her. Daniel kissed her for the first time, and it felt like coming home after a long journey. Storm and Ember celebrated by flying loops around the lake and breathing gouts of flame into the sky and making sounds of pure joy. When they landed, they both nuzzled Daniel and Lyra, and the four of them stayed at the lake for the rest of the day, just enjoying being together. Over the next few days, Daniel discovered the full extent of his new abilities. He could now use the handlight easily, and had a basic ability to sense emotions in others, and his physical strength had increased noticeably. Lyra taught him how to control these new gifts and warned him that he would continue to develop new abilities over the coming months and years. As his body fully adapted, the colony threw them a farewell party, and everyone came to wish Daniel well and meet Lyra properly and see the dragons up close. The children gave Storm and Ember so many fish that both dragons looked uncomfortable and had to lie down to digest. Patricia gave Daniel a data chip containing all the colony's records and told him to remember where he came from. On their last morning, Daniel stood in his empty apartment and looked at the photograph of his wife one final time. He picked it up and held it close and whispered that he hoped she understood and that he would always love her, but that he needed to keep living. Then he carefully packed the photo in his bag because some memories were worth carrying forward. Lyra was waiting outside with Storm and Ember, and when Daniel emerged, she smiled and held out her hand. He took it, and together they climbed onto Storm's back and lifted into the sky. Daniel looked back once at the colony growing smaller beneath them, and then turned to face forward toward whatever adventures waited ahead. The first few months of traveling with Lyra were overwhelming for Daniel in the best possible way, as they visited 7 different planets and helped people with problems ranging from medical emergencies to natural disasters to political negotiations that needed a neutral party. Storm and Ember were incredible assets because very few beings wanted to argue when two massive dragons were present, and Daniel learned that the universe respected strength but also appreciated compassion. On a water planet called Tethys Prime, they helped evacuate a floating city that was being destroyed by a massive storm, and Storm and Ember carried hundreds of people to safety, while Daniel and Lyra used their magic to reinforce buildings until everyone could escape. The grateful residents gave them supplies and star maps and information about other worlds that might need help. On a desert world named Eridus, they found a colony of human settlers who were dying from a strange illness, and Lyra used the star crystals to power healing magic that saved dozens of lives. Daniel worked alongside her and discovered he had a natural talent for healing magic, which Lyra said was rare even among elves. The settlers wanted them to stay permanently, but Lyra explained gently that they were wanderers and needed to keep moving. Daniel was adapting to his new abilities faster than Lyra had expected, and he could now sense emotions from hundreds of feet away, and could move small objects with his mind, and had even managed to convince a locked door to open itself by speaking to the metal, the way Lyra spoke to stone. She told him he had the potential to become more powerful than most elves, because humans had a flexibility in their thinking that allowed them to use magic in creative ways. They visited stations and colonies and cities and wild planets, with no inhabitants, and everywhere they went, people stared at the human who rode dragons and traveled with an elf. Some were friendly and some were suspicious, and a few tried to capture Storm and Ember for study or profit, but those attempts ended badly for the would-be captors, because the dragons were far more intelligent and dangerous than most people realized. Daniel sent regular messages back to the colony on Kepler 442b and told them about his adventures and included pictures of the strange and beautiful places he visited. Patricia always wrote back with news from home and assured him that everyone was doing well and that they enjoyed hearing about his travels. He appreciated the connection to his old life even as he built a new one. On a planet with purple vegetation and 3 suns, Lyra took Daniel to meet a group of other elves who lived in a city built into the side of a cliff. These elves were scholars and historians, and they were fascinated by Daniel because bonded humans were extremely rare, and they wanted to study him and document his abilities. Daniel agreed as long as they were respectful, and he ended up spending 2 weeks answering questions and demonstrating his magic. The scholars told him that there were fewer than 50 recorded cases of humans bonding with elves in the past 10,000 years, and that most of those bonds had ended tragically because the cultural differences were too great, or because the human could not handle the isolation of living for centuries. They seemed worried that Daniel and Lyra were making a mistake, but Daniel assured them he knew what he was getting into. One of the older scholars took Daniel aside and told him that the key to a successful bond was maintaining his humanity, even as he gained elven abilities. She said that the humans who had thrived in these bonds were the ones who remembered where they came from and who they were, and did not try to become something they were not. Daniel thanked her for the advice and promised to remember it. After leaving the Scholar City, they traveled to a region of space that was having problems with pirates and slavers, and Lyra felt compelled to help even though it was dangerous. They spent 3 months working with local security forces and using Storm and Ember to track down pirate bases and free captured people. Daniel discovered he had a talent for strategy and planning, and he helped coordinate several successful rescue operations. During one particularly difficult rescue, Daniel was shot by a pirate's energy weapon, and the pain was unlike anything he had ever felt. Lyra healed him immediately using star crystal magic, but she was terrified and angry, and Daniel felt her fear through their bond. That night she told him she could not lose him, and made him promise to be more careful, and Daniel promised even though they both knew that their work would always involve some danger. They celebrated Daniel's first bonding anniversary by returning to the lake on Kepler 442b, where the ceremony had taken place, and they spent a peaceful week camping by the water and flying with the dragons and remembering how far they had come. The colony residents visited and brought gifts and food, and it felt like coming home, even though Daniel knew he could never live there permanently again. Patricia had retired, and the new director was a young man named Carlos, who was fascinated by Daniel's transformation and asked endless questions about what it was like to be bonded to an elf. Daniel tried to explain the constant awareness of Lyra's presence in his mind, and the way their emotions flowed between them and the deep sense of belonging he felt, but words seemed inadequate. During their visit, Daniel went to the memorial garden, where there was a marker for his late wife, and he stood there for a long time, just thinking about how much his life had changed. Lyra waited nearby and gave him space, but he could feel her supportive presence through the bond. He told his wife's memory about Lyra, and about Storm and Ember, and about the life he was building, and he felt at peace. When they left Kepler 442b, Daniel knew it would probably be years before he returned, because the universe was vast and there were so many places to explore and people to help. But he also knew the colony would always be there, and would always welcome him back, and that knowledge was comforting. Their travels took them to the edge of known space, where stars were sparse and planets were rare, and they encountered species that had never seen humans or elves or dragons before. Some of these encounters were friendly, and some were tense, but Daniel learned that most beings in the universe wanted the same basic things, which were safety and food and connection with others. On a frozen moon orbiting a gas giant, they found an ancient temple that had been built by a civilization that died out thousands of years ago, and inside the temple were star crystals of a type that Lyra had never seen before. These crystals had different properties and could store memories and knowledge, and Lyra was excited because they could revolutionize how information was preserved on Silverwood. Daniel helped her carefully excavate and catalog the crystals, and he felt proud to be contributing something significant to her people's knowledge. Lyra told him that when they eventually visited Silverwood, she would present these crystals to the scholars, and they would finally have to acknowledge that her choice to leave and explore had value. They talked about going to Silverwood someday, but both of them were content to keep wandering for now and helping people and seeing new things. Daniel had never been happier, and through their bond he knew that Lyra felt the same way. They had found something that many people searched for their whole lives and never found, which was a true partnership built on love and respect and shared purpose. Storm and Ember had grown even larger and more powerful, and the dragons seemed to understand that Daniel was now permanent family. Storm especially had bonded with Daniel, and would often insist that Daniel ride on his back instead of Lyra riding on Ember, and the four of them had developed a rhythm and understanding that made them an incredibly effective team. As they flew toward their next destination, which was a colony that needed help with a failing water purification system, Daniel looked at Lyra sitting in front of him on Storm's back and felt gratitude for the chance encounter that had changed his life. He had been a lonely widower going through the motions, and now he was an explorer and healer and partner to an amazing woman who had given him centuries to live and love and make a difference in the universe. The stars stretched endlessly before them, and Daniel smiled because he finally understood what it meant to truly live.